Part 1. Not a Tragedy, a Calamity. A common counter against the claim of Native American genocide is that indigenous peoples fought wars of conquest against each other too. Superficially, this fact is compelling. For centuries, Native nations battled over land, slaughtered each other, even ethnically cleansed. So why should we condemn European settlers for participating in this battle royale? Consider that for centuries Europeans fought vicious wars against each other, yet this fact does not diminish the heinousness of the Holocaust. Why? Because the Holocaust was not just another conflict between European peoples over land or resources or religious doctrine. The Holocaust was a project based on the ideological conviction that the world would be a better place without Jews. The incredible diversity of European Jews mattered not to the Nazis. Whether Polish, German, French, Italian, rich or poor, secular or devout, a collaborator or a resistor, all Jews were marked out for annihilation because the Nazis wanted a world without Jews. Anglo-settlers wanted a world without Indians. In the United States, the project of genocide was carried out through settler colonialism. The UN defines genocide as the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group through the following means. All those means were deployed by settlers, although this video will only explore A and C. Settler colonialism is a project where one people moves to another land, displaces the people already there, and attempts to construct a new society. The project of Anglo-settler colonialism was built on the ideological and material conviction that all indigenous peoples were savages whose very existence threatened the Anglo-American way of life, perpetual commercial and property expansion. As the Commissioner of Indian Affairs wrote in 1838, common property and civilization cannot coexist. In the words of Patrick Wolfe, Indians were the original communist menace. Settlers disagreed on how to deal with what they called the Indian problem, but they generally agreed on the goal of a world without Indians. Not every settler shared this goal, just as not every German supported the final solution. But the European conquest of the North American continent was in every sense of the word genocidal. The past is filled with many unspeakable tragedies that we would change if we could, but cannot. However, settler colonialism is not a tragedy. Tragedy connotes finality, something over and done. Settler colonialism is an ongoing calamity. The defense that no genocide happened because Native Americans fought wars too, while not always made in bad faith, often serves the pernicious purpose of affirming American exceptionalism. You see, violence is universal. Every society has fought wars, colonized, and enslaved. In its sins, the U.S. is unexceptional, but in its virtues, it is exceptional. For the world is a better place than it would have been if not for U.S. domination. Anyways, all that tragic, unexceptional violence is a thing of the past. As William Faulkner wrote, the past is never dead. It isn't even past. Settler colonialism still operates, insidiously. For one, Native Americans, against incredible odds, survived, and the U.S. still pillages them. Two, the processes which drove settler colonialism, the need for perpetual commercial expansion, or capitalism, continues, and it drives the U.S. to commit atrocities around the world in the name of democracy. 3. The narrative of tragic, unexceptional historical violence produces what I call settler colonial realism, the illusion that all native and non-capitalist societies just naturally collapse or devolve into authoritarianism. Part 2. The astonishing variety of indigenous peoples. The term Native American is intentionally homogenizing, which leads to ridiculous arguments about whether or not Native Americans were peaceful or lived in harmony with nature. The reality is that Native Americans were incredibly diverse. In fact, the United States government recognizes 574 distinct indigenous nations. Some Native nations were hierarchical, urbanized, inegalitarian. Such was the case with the Mississippian peoples. In the 11th century, 10 to 15,000 persons lived in the 0.69 square mile urban center of Cahokia. That is 15 to 22,000 people per square mile, about the same population density as San Francisco. Intense inequality defined this culture with centralized religious and political power. Some indigenous nations were very much communal. Such was the case with the Algonquian tribes of southern New England, who organized around usufruct, the principle that land belonged not to individuals, but to the village. People had a right to personal property, to work the land, and to keep whatever they produced, but no one could permanently and exclusively claim the land. Some native cultures were matrilineal, which means that they traced lineage through the mother's line, and that gave women lots of power. In Iroquois cultures, the clan mother selected the chief of the tribe and could remove him if he neglected his duties. Navajo cultures accorded rights not only to people, but to plants and animals. In places like the Southeast, slavery was common. Part 3. The Homicidal Homogenization of Indigenous Peoples. None of this diversity mattered to Anglo-settlers, who wanted a world without Indians. A world without Indians was necessary because settler prosperity depended upon perpetual expansion. In observations concerning the increase of mankind, Benjamin Franklin observed that those who cannot get land must labor for others that have it, and when laborers are plenty, their wages will be low. Land in America, however, was plenty, allowing a laboring man in a short time to save enough money to purchase a piece of new land. Thus, abundant land afforded American settlers comfortable independence, whereas scarce land in Europe forced most Europeans to depend on meager wages. Maintenance of settler prosperity required continually augmenting settler land holdings. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson mused that it is impossible not to look forward to distant times, when our rapid multiplication will expand itself beyond those limits and cover the whole northern, if not the southern continent, with a people speaking the same language, governed in similar form by similar laws. To facilitate rapid multiplication, Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory despite believing the federal government is limited only to powers explicitly enumerated in the Constitution, which does not mention land purchases. In 1825, President John Quincy Adams articulated what became known as Manifest Destiny, the idea that Anglo-American civilization was destined to spread from sea to sea. The world should be familiarized with the idea of considering our proper domain to be the continent of North America. From the time we became an independent people, it was as much a law of nature that this should become our pretension that the Mississippi should flow to the sea. For settler civilization to stretch from sea to sea, settlers had to remove Native Americans. On this matter, most settlers agreed, but they disagreed on how to accomplish it. Frontiersmen usually supported slaughter. As California's first governor, Peter Burnett, predicted in 1850, a war of extermination will be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. Those influenced by Lockean liberalism, which holds that human nature is a blank slate, believed that natives could be assimilated. A contemporary of Thomas Jefferson wrote that, "Natural history teaches us that the physical differences between nations are but inconsiderable, and history informs us that civilization has been constantly preceded by barbarity and rudeness. Note that assimilationists reduced all the diversity of indigenous peoples to barbarity and rudeness. Native Americans could live if they agreed to give up their culture, religion, language, and kinship ties. Even then, it was accepted that it would take generations for them to achieve equality with white settlers. In the meantime, natives would serve as cheap laborers. As federal agents declared in 1851, the only options for Native Americans was extermination or domestication. The latter includes all proper measures for their protection and gradual improvement, and secures to the people of California an element greatly needed in the development of its resources, cheap labor. What we might call liberal realism rejected both slaughter and assimilation. As a newspaper editor wrote, Indians must be annihilated by the advance of the white man, but annihilation did not have to be accelerated by the deadly rifle. Instead, natives could be herded onto barren reservations and allowed to peacefully die off. The primary mechanism of Indian removal was ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing usually followed the same pattern. Settlers invaded native lands, inciting native resistance, leading to the U.S. Army removing natives purportedly for their own protection. In the early Republic, settlers pushed aside Native Americans in northern Ohio, central Indiana, western Kentucky, Tennessee, and Vermont. In the 1790s, the U.S. created a standing army to clear the Ohio Valley of Native Americans. Between 1790 and 1796, wars against Native Americans accounted for over 80% of federal government expenditures. Secretary of War Henry Knox wrote in 1790 that the Indians held the right of soil and could choose whether or not to sell their lands, but this concept of free choice broke down under the pressure of frontier advance. The same pattern continued throughout the 19th century. Andrew Jackson became famous by massacring Creeks and Seminoles in the southeast to clear land for plantations. After allying with rival Creeks to the Red Sticks during the 1813-1814 Creek Civil War, Jackson forced his allies to sign a treaty ceding 23 million acres. Ally or not, settlers always screwed natives. As president, Andrew Jackson officially implemented Indian removal, the policy of forcibly moving Native Americans from the southeastern United States to lands west of the Mississippi. Known as the Trail of Tears, Indian removal caused the deaths of 8,000 to 12,000 Native Americans and dispossessed them of over 100 million acres. In justification, Jackson proclaimed, "What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms?" Settler crassness was not always so unadulterated. Typically, they cast their aggressions as benevolence. Advocates of removal claimed it would allow Indians at least a little bit of time to divest their Indianness. As Andrew Jackson's Secretary of War, Lewis Cass, told Congress in 1831, "It is certainly better for them to meet the difficulties of removal with the probability of an adequate and final return than, yielding to their constitutional apathy, to sit and perish." Especially instructive is that the Cherokee and Creek had adapted. They practiced sedentary agriculture, wrote constitutions, and established schools. Many learned English and converted to Christianity. In the end, they were still deemed savages, because all the talk of civilization was just a pretext for whites to plunder native lands. Assimilation, in fact, seemed to disturb settlers even more because it denoted native permanence. As Lorenzo Veracini wrote, "Successful assimilation is never dependent upon the performance of native peoples." Like most proponents of limited government, Andrew Jackson expanded the power of the government in the name of protecting freedom. Government can never be big as long as it is used to fight a racialized evil. The U.S. Army aided genocidal volunteer militias in California, which I covered in this video, and then in the late 19th century forced natives in the western United States onto reservations. Because settlers characterized all indigenous people as savages, and because natives resisted white incursions, the wars they fought were scorched earth. Settlers burned down native fields and villages, extirpated game, and indiscriminately massacred women and children. During the Revolutionary War, settlers killed natives for scalps, which could be redeemed for cash, a practice 19th century Western states copied. George Washington instructed Major General John Sullivan in 1779 to lay waste all the settlements of the Iroquois. The Sullivan expedition demolished 40 villages and winter stores, creating a famine that killed over half the Iroquois population. It earned George Washington the moniker Town Destroyer. In 1807, Thomas Jefferson instructed his Secretary of War that any Indian who resisted American expansion into their lands be met with the hatchet. And if ever we are constrained to lift the hatchet against any tribe, we will never lay it down till that tribe is exterminated or is driven beyond the Mississippi. To defeat the Lakota and Sioux during the Plains Indian Wars, the U.S. Army encouraged settlers to extirpate bison. Hunters killed 3.5 million bison in the southern plains between 1871 and 1879, driving them nearly to extinction. As one colonel told a hunter, "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." Part 4. The Tragic Necessity of Indigenous Disappearance. Settlers euphemized colonial violence through appeals to natural history and metaphors of inevitability. In a private letter towards the end of the War for Independence, George Washington wrote that, "The gradual extension of our settlements will as certainly cause the savage as the wolf to retire, both being beasts of prey, though they differ in shape." Henry Clay, one of the most influential politicians in the mid-19th century United States, lamented that "the poor children of the forest have been driven by the great wave which has flowed in the Atlantic Ocean to almost the base of the Rocky Mountains, and overwhelming them in its terrible progress." We should be clear here about what commerce and private land ownership mean. Indigenous peoples traded goods and owned personal property too. Anglo-American commerce wasn't about securing resources, alleviating scarcity, or cementing social relations. For capitalists, commerce was a relentless drive to transform all of nature and human life into commodities which they could buy, sell, and accumulate. For settlers, commerce and property was about achieving competency, a comfortable independence, which in 19th century terms meant acquiring enough wealth and land to protect themselves from the vicissitudes of capitalist markets. As Thomas Jefferson wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia, men who looked to their own soil and industry for their subsistence achieved independence, unlike those who depend for it on the casualties and caprice of customers. While we have to labor, then, let us never wish to see our citizens occupied at a workbench or toiling at distaff. For the general operations of manufacture, let our workshops remain in Europe. It is not that Anglo-Americans rejected the fruits of industrial commerce, but they saw how in Britain's industrial cities capitalist production reduced large swaths of the population to low-paid, insecure wage work. Spatial expansion reconciled the contradictions of capitalism for Anglo-Americans, who could obtain the benefits of capitalist industry through free trade while exporting the cost to people in other countries. Capitalist industry eventually triumphed over Jefferson's republicanism, something I've covered in this video, but the illusion of free land sustained the myth that comfortable independence was available to every man willing to work. As Abraham Lincoln said, "The man who labored for another last year, this year labors for himself, and next year he will hire others to labor for him." In 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act, entitling every American to 160 acres of public land so long as they were willing to settle on it for at least 5 years. Yet again, this necessitated dispossessing natives. It is no coincidence that the brutal Plains Indians Wars followed. Racial hierarchy entitled white men to land and to government protection. The 1867 California Democratic Convention stated that this government was made on the white basis, by white men, for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever, and should be administered by white men and none others. The white must be protected, whatever may be the consequence to other races. In a letter to the Stockton Times, a veteran of the U.S.-Mexico War wrote that Mexican men were made to be shot at, and Mexican women were made for our purposes because a Mexican is pretty near black. Rebutting the doctrines of racial equality espoused by radical Republicans, the woke left of the 1860s, a newspaper editor asked them to reflect that the Pilgrim Fathers made the interests of the red men of the forest succumb to what they conceived to be their interests. Upon this principle, the Indians have been almost nearly exterminated, and the last war, for their total annihilation, is now being waged. On this principle, he argued for Chinese exclusion, as well as asserting that if Africans were free, they would be annihilated like the red man. Even those who deplored violence accepted that Euro-American civilization was incompatible with any form of society which impeded the maximization of commerce and private land ownership. Sympathetic whites celebrated as progress the conditions that accelerated indigenous demise, the devastation of ecosystems. People who dismissed the genocide of Native Americans often naturalized their decline through disease. While disease played a significant role, just as important was that starvation made natives more susceptible to disease. Whereas natives had to rely on the land for survival, settlers could access international markets which were obsessed with extracting resources from its frontier peripheries. So settlers shamelessly plundered the environment. California settlers cut down a third of the state's forests in 20 years. Hydraulic mining thickened the rivers with debris, chasing off all the fish. This helped reduce the California native population from 150,000 in 1846 to 30,000 in 1870. California's largest newspaper, the San Francisco-based Daily Alta, understood that the settlement of the whites in the plains and valleys has necessarily driven the game from the old grounds where the Indians derived their supplies. Yet they still cast California as a God-given, goodly heritage, rich with virgin soil as yet untended by the plowshare, the husbandman, and settler labor as destined to make California the entrepot for the riches of the Indies, the whole eastern continent, and the islands of the western seas. The celebration of settler labor also rationalized genocide. Anglo-American mythology characterized the actions of settlers as good works, as the courage to cross the sea, enter into the unknown, build cabins, hew out farms, overcome obstacles, raise families, forge communities, worship God, and build the imagined community of the nation. During the 19th century, the Society of California Pioneers published speeches and poems extolling the Herculean labor of pioneers who developed the magnitude of the country, the fertility of its soil, the fecundity of its productions, the nature and abundance of its resources, and who marched over unknown mountains and deserts through famine, sickness, and doubt to accomplish the miraculous destiny of democratic regeneration. California gold rushers were cast as the culmination of a great impulse that brought the light of civilization across the continent. These fantasies made violence against Native Americans seem an exception to the peaceful and inevitable expansion of benevolent Anglo-Saxon civilization. At one point, the Daily Alta attributed all native difficulties to outrages committed by the unhung rascals who disgrace our nation and our race. Journalist James Ayers wrote that settlers were builders, not destroyers, who, in creating a splendid commonwealth out of the wilderness, subjugated nothing but the soil, and walked over no prostrate race to reach the pinnacle of their ambition. These fantasies disavowed the role of native labor in making the United States possible. When settlers arrived at Plymouth Rock in 1620, they found open, park-like forests abundant with game. They thought they had discovered an Edenic paradise. Their first merciless New England winter taught them otherwise. Of the original 102 settlers, only about half survived. The forests were park-like because of controlled burnings, one of the many ways indigenous peoples altered their environments. Controlled burning fostered vegetation conducive to wildlife such as deer, elk, turkey, and quail. The abundance of the New World, in other words, wasn't natural. Natives cultivated it. Yet those facts never disabused settlers of the belief that natives were like wild beasts living in a state of nature. The early settlers in Virginia and New England relied on native hospitality, knowledge, and food to survive the alien and unpredictable environments of the East Coast, which were deadly for European livestock and incompatible with English agricultural practices. Natives showed Europeans where and how they could grow crops, and today, a once wild seed made edible by centuries of cultivation, corn, comprises more than half the calories Americans consume. As settlers moved west, they relied on native guides and trails. In California, federal Indian agents observed that whites generally located their houses near those of natives, so that they could more readily command the services of the Indians. Whites not only erected their own homes near native villages, but laid out towns around and over them, which eventually had to drive Indians from their homes. Settler fantasies projected their own violence onto natives, who were transformed from essential partners in white settlement to just another violent obstacle to be overcome in the unforgiving wilderness. Of course, settlers knew that indigenous peoples were not actually primitive animals, but their conception of democracy relied on denying native agency. Arguably, the foundational text for Anglo-American democracy, John Locke's Second Treaty on Civil Government, was premised on the idea that the Americas represented land before history, land in the state of nature. In Locke's conceptualization, all land originally existed in the commons and only became property when individuals added their labor to it. In one of his examples, he noted that the Indian who kills a deer has a right to the carcass, but not to the forest since he did not alter it. As we know, and the settlers knew, that was false. Natives did alter the forest, but for Anglo-American democracy to be just, the New World had to be terra nullius, nobody's land. American government was consensual because any man who wished to withdraw his consent could just plant in some inland, vacant places of America. Settlers also obscured the violence of colonialism through pathologizing their victims. They blamed indigenous indolence, not white aggression, for native decline, even though indigenous nations existed for thousands of years before European contact. Thomas Jefferson's Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, stated that the Indian disappears before the white man simply because he will not work. California's 5th governor, John Weller, confessed that whites destroyed the trees from which natives obtained food, yet he still asserted that indigenous populations declined because of their opinion that labor is dishonorable. Settlers cast native decline as natural and inevitable due to factors outside anyone's control, such as disease, but also because natives supposedly could not adapt to white civilization. This is simply false. Natives adapted. When settlers destroyed their traditional sources of food, they became miners, farm workers, and ranch hands. Nevertheless, since whites assumed that natives were supposed to go away, the continuous presence of natives challenged white progress, and the assumption of extinction carried with it an assumption of intrinsic guilt. Federal Indian agent J. Ross Brown wrote that settlers killed natives who failed to perish from hunger or exposure on the general principle that they must have subsisted by stealing cattle. In one incident along the Feather River in 1850, a group of miners, after losing several oxen, raised a party, proceeded to a rancheria in the mountains, surrounded the huts, killed 14 natives, and demolished their houses. When they returned home, they had found the ox returned. A federal Indian agent noted that affairs where whites killed natives over missing livestock that eventually returned was becoming frequent. Natives did sometimes steal livestock, but not because they were too lazy to work or lusted after the trinkets of Anglo-American civilization, as claimed by people such as Governor Peter Burnett. It was because they were driven to desperation by the continual aggressions of paranoid, racist white settlers. The context of native resistance was almost always erased. Settlers from a young age learned about bloodthirsty savages and were fed a steady stream of rumors about Indian massacres that almost always turned out to be false. As federal agent Reddick McKee wrote in a letter to California Governor John Bigler, it would have been an endless as well as thankless task to notice and correct the 1,000 extravagant statements made on this subject. Part 5. The Persistence of Indigenous Peoples. Settlers sometimes ceded lands they thought worthless, such as in 1868 when the Treaty of Fort Laramie granted the Black Hills to the Lakota. But when settlers discovered gold in the Black Hills, the U.S. government sent in the army to force the Lakota and Sioux to sign a treaty surrendering the suddenly valuable lands. Similar processes still operate. Indigenous sovereignty is only respected until the relentlessly extractive capitalist economy requires resources on native lands. We build oil pipelines through reservations, construct reservoirs that flood native lands so millionaire farmers can grow thirsty crops in the desert, and open lithium mines on indigenous territory in the name of a green consumerist revolution. This is unlawful and wrong, but even if we think about this only pragmatically, native sovereignty matters because indigenous lands are some of the only places on Earth which capitalists haven't completely despoiled. Despite making up only 5% of the world's population, indigenous peoples steward 80% of the world's biodiversity. On the importance of indigenous cultures, I recommend these videos from Ankur Shah. Part 6. The Necessity of Global Homogenization. At the close of the 19th century, fears that the end of the frontier endangered U.S. prosperity compelled businessmen and imperialists such as Theodore Roosevelt to back overseas expansion and colonize the Philippines, a topic I've covered in this video. Opposition formed in the Anti-Imperialist League, which denounced colonialism as un-American. Theodore Roosevelt retorted that overseas expansion was just a continuation of the process which made the United States possible. He stated that the doctrines of the Anti-Imperialist League, if carried out, would make it incumbent upon us to leave the Apaches of Arizona to work out their own salvation, and to decline to interfere in a single Indian reservation. Their doctrines condemn your forefathers and mine for having ever settled in these United States. The American way of hyper-consumerism, which we attribute to freedom, democracy, and private enterprise, depends upon the relentless extraction of resources from around the globe. To ensure commercial supremacy, the U.S. has 800 international military bases and funds 3/4 of the world's dictators. In other words, just as American democracy depended upon the disavowal of native sovereignty, modern American freedom and commerce relies upon the negation of economic and political sovereignty in other countries. As Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace stated in 1943, private enterprise in the United States can only survive if it expands and grows. The old frontiers must be rebuilt. Franklin Roosevelt's Assistant Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, put it this way: "We cannot have full employment and prosperity in the United States without the foreign markets." To guarantee foreign markets, the U.S. deposes uncooperative foreign governments and wages scorched earth warfare. In the early 20th century, this included setting up puppet dictators in Central America and the Caribbean and viciously repressing peasant rebellions, a topic I've covered in this video. When Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz proposed to redistribute United Fruit Company lands to peasants in the 1950s, the CIA orchestrated a coup, triggering a civil war which killed 200,000 people. When the Vietnamese people rejected a puppet Western government in favor of the communist Viet Cong, the U.S. firebombed the country, killing 1 to 3 million people, and dropped 13 million gallons of Agent Orange, a highly toxic herbicide that killed 400,000 people, caused 500,000 birth defects, and gave 2 million people cancer. When Chile elected a socialist in 1970, Nixon instructed the CIA to make Chile's economy scream. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger feared that the election of a socialist might discredit Cold War propaganda, which purported that socialism was incompatible with democracy. In a memo to Nixon, Kissinger wrote that the example of a successful elected Marxist government in Chile would surely have an impact on, and even precedent value for, other parts of the world. The Nixon regime backed General Augusto Pinochet, who tortured and killed 30,000 people. When left-wing governments came to power in Central America in the late 1970s, the CIA sponsored death squads, the Contras, who executed hundreds of thousands of peasants and sexually enslaved thousands of young girls. Today, the U.S. imposes inhumane sanctions that cause mass starvation, and as recently as 2019 backed a coup in Bolivia. According to one study, U.S. interventions have caused 20 to 30 million deaths since 1945. Another study found that the War on Terror alone has created almost 60 million refugees. Part 7. Settler Colonial Realism. The condition of what I call settler colonial realism is the inability to imagine, or accept as viable, any economic and political form of organization which deviates from Western European or settler American models. What distinguishes settler colonial realism from Orientalism, neo-imperialism, Eurocentrism, or capitalist realism is how it specifically emerges from settler American mythology, which casts the United States as a non-colonizing country. This has two implications. First, unlike European countries, the United States supposedly did not develop through extraction of foreign resources and exploitation of foreign peoples. It is supposedly an empire of liberty. As famous philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote, "The colonialism and imperialism of European nations was the one great crime in which America was never involved." Second, U.S. foreign policy, allegedly unmotivated by colonial ambition, is, with some egregious exceptions, supposed to be a force for good in the world. By erasing the processes of settler colonialism in U.S. development and foreign policy, settler colonial realism produces the illusion that indigenous and non-capitalist societies just naturally collapse or devolve into authoritarianism. The reality is that any society which threatens total global capitalist domination is subject to relentless counter-revolutionary capitalist onslaught, which either crushes them or forces them to operate in a constant state of siege. Just as settlers erased the diversity of indigenous peoples in the context of their resistance through the concept of savagery, the concept of authoritarianism erases the enormous diversity of numerous, mostly non-white societies, and how they all, just like our own, contain elements of both liberation and coercion. It reduces them to a modern stereotype of savagery, thereby recreating terra nullius. The rest of the mostly non-white world is supposedly stuck in a state of despotic nature, waiting to be liberated by American capitalism and democracy. The Middle East, for example, is viewed by many Westerners as a place outside of time, a theocratic and tribalistic 10th century culture with 21st century technology. Yet functioning secular democracies developed in several Middle Eastern countries. Iran, for example, was a parliamentary democracy, but when Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh proposed nationalizing oil in the 1950s, the CIA and MI6 orchestrated a coup and installed a puppet dictator, the Shah. It took a theocratic revolution to overthrow the Shah. After the removal of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, ordinary Iraqis spontaneously organized dozens of local and provisional elections. In surveys, only 20% of Iraqis said they wanted a theocratic government. But when a large percent of Iraqis indicated they would be more likely to support a party that advocated for more government jobs, Paul Bremer decided to cancel local and provisional elections and select a group of Iraqi leaders to draft a new constitution. Massive peaceful demonstrations broke out, 30,000 people in Basra and 100,000 in Baghdad, calling for elections instead of selections. After peaceful protests had no effect, many Shia became convinced that they would have to fight for majority rule. Over the next 3.5 years, coalition forces imprisoned and tortured 60,000 Iraqis. Military officers confessed to the Red Cross that 70 to 90% of these detentions were mistakes. Detention centers, most notably Abu Ghraib, became breeding grounds for insurgents. The wrongfully detained became the foot soldiers of Islamic militias, which provided emergency generators, garbage collection, and security to communities ravaged by the American invasion. The militias also recruited from the unemployed masses. Bremer fired 500,000 state workers and privatized 200 state companies. He claimed privatization was necessary to make Iraq companies competitive, but American companies were given no-bid contracts with guaranteed profits. Parsons was paid $186 million to build 142 health clinics. Only 6 were ever built. Much of the early sectarian violence was directed against foreign contract workers. As one resistor said, "Either we set the factory on fire or we blow ourselves up in it, but it will not be privatized." And the number of Iraqis surveyed saying they wanted theocratic government increased from 20% to 70%. Yet the story of Iranian theocracy and Iraqi chaos is that those cultures were incompatible with democracy, not that capital crushed incipient democracy. The Western media characterizes a number of left-wing Latin American governments, including those of Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Bolivia, as authoritarian. What these accounts usually leave out is how the preceding governments, typically ultra-right-wing, brutally oppressed the poor and indigenous populations, as well as how conservative forces continually collaborated with Western governments to try to restore racist anti-indigenous governments. When it comes to left-wing governments, Western media relies on the trope of fallen grace, which erases how capitalist governments persistently produce poverty and inequality, the conditions which gave rise to left-wing governments. The media, for example, portrays pre-Chavez Venezuela as a paradise lost, but before the Hugo Chavez presidency, half of Venezuelans lived in poverty, nearly a fifth in extreme poverty. per capita GDP consistently declined from 1986 to 1999. In other words, Venezuelans weren't just poor, they were getting poorer every year pre-Chavez. In many cases, left-wing governments delivered universal education, healthcare, housing, jobs, and nutritional programs for the poor and indigenous populations. The improvements to the lives of poor Cubans, who have longer life expectancies now than Americans, is why the communist government has remained in power in Cuba despite suffering half a century of embargo from the world's largest economy. There are repressive aspects of Cuba's communism, but you have to ask why the capitalist and pro-Western government of Batista, backed by history's greatest superpower, could only last 7 years, while the villainous communist dictatorship relentlessly opposed by that same superpower has managed to survive over 60 years. We must think through the lens of both alienations and attachments. In rejecting neoliberal reforms implemented by the previous right-wing, anti-indigenous government, Evo Morales and the movement for socialism raised GDP per capita 50% between 2005 and 2018, the fastest rate of growth in Latin America, and reduced extreme poverty by 60%. That is why the coup in 2019 ultimately didn't stick. We cannot understand the way these societies have evolved outside the violence of U.S. capitalism. For example, one of the ways the CIA undermined the Arbenz presidency was by flooding Guatemala with disinformation, claiming that Arbenz was planning to ban Catholicism and send children to re-education camps. Cuban revolutionaries learned from Guatemala that capitalists and reactionaries would destabilize any revolutionary society with disinformation and terror if they didn't actively militate against it. These fears were continually affirmed as the U.S. dropped counter-revolutionary leaflets in Cuba and invited killers and torturers in Florida to plot and commit countless acts of violence against Cuba. The historically conscious rejection of U.S. imperialism and domination is why, despite real economic failures, exacerbated but not caused by U.S. sanctions, Chavism endures in Venezuela. When the Venezuelan army, at the behest of the Bush administration, tried to remove Chavez in 2002, so many poor Venezuelans rose up, people the New York Times described as truckers and maids, that the army was forced to restore Chavez. Likewise, even in the midst of famine, U.S. attempts to recognize Juan Guaido's claims to the presidency have been met with enormous anti-imperialist protests from Venezuela's black, mestizo, and indigenous populations. Part 8. The Calamitous Normality of Hitler. Hitler believed that the survival and prosperity of the German peoples depended upon removing racial dregs and ethnically cleansing Eastern Europe to make room for German settlers. English settler colonialism was his model, and he wanted to do in Eastern Europe what England had done in North America and Australia. Sadly, this mentality is not passed. Here are quotes from 4 different people spanning the past 170 years, all implying the same disturbing idea that genocide can make the world a better place. From a Gold Rush-era newspaper, 1850. We believe that the almost complete annihilation of the Indian tribes by the settlers of New England and the Atlantic states generally is one of the principal causes of the present differences between the condition of Mexico and the condition of the United States. It would have been infinitely more difficult for the Spaniard to exterminate the Mexican Indians than it was for our ancestors to drive out Mohawks and Narragansetts. But had Cortez pursued such a policy, how much better would it have been for the permanent interests of Mexico? Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf, 1925. North America shows a different humanity and culture from Central and South America, where the predominantly Latin immigrants often mixed with the Aborigines on a large scale. The Germanic inhabitant of the American continent, who has remained racially pure and unmixed, rose to be master of the continent. Winston Churchill, to the Palestine Royal Commission, 1937. I do not admit that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place. Matt Walsh, columnist for the Daily Wire, on Twitter, October 11, 2021. I'm happy that this land was conquered. It is an immeasurably better place now than it would have been had Europeans never showed up. I'm proud of our history and grateful. I will never apologize for it. I will celebrate our heroes and laugh in your face when you cry about it. Who else do the deniers of genocide believe should be gotten rid of to make the world a better place?